Set up the recording. Well, welcome everyone to the second session on the book of Daniel, and we're looking this time at chapter 2. So just as a quick recap, in chapter 1, we saw that over a period of 3 years, Daniel was trained in the literature and language of the Chaldeans. That was the language of those in Babylon. And we see evidence of this from chapters 2 through 7 when he starts writing in the Aramaic language and using what's called an Aramaic chiasm, which follows what can be only termed like a mirror type structure. So you can see there the first part matches the last, the second chapter 3 matches chapter 6, and chapter 4 to chapter 5. So today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, which is going to be an overview of the times of the Gentiles from a human perspective. And this will match up later on with chapter 7 when we get to that, which is, again, an overview of the time of the Gentiles, but from the divine perspective. So you can see they have the same type of theme, but just from different viewpoints. So we're going to see this matching pairs concept going through this section of Daniel written in Aramaic. Time-wise, we're now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. And so what that means is we have gone forward in time from when we first, chapter 1, we were in 605 BC, and we're now sometime in about 602 BC, about 3 years later. And this is the first year of Daniel's service after his 3 years of training, which was mentioned back in chapter 1. And so now we're picking up, as it were, 3 years later, and basically he is in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams, and they trouble him, and his sleep left him. And so interesting here that basically Nebuchadnezzar, just to come back to what he's saying here, in the first chapter, he'd referenced the years of King Jehoiakim, and that's because that's where he was located when the story starts. He's back in Judah. But now that he's in Babylon, from now on, he's going to reference Gentile kings, in particular here Nebuchadnezzar, because that's where he's living. He's living in Babylon. And so basically what's going to happen here with him eventually saving the lives of all the wise men is that this is going to help prevent any jealousy against him during the years that he's in various senior positions in the Babylonian kingdom. And so now we have the setting. The king has these dreams and he can't ignore them. His sleep left him. And so what does he do? He gathers or commands that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. So we've got several groups mentioned here that have been called in. We have firstly magicians, and those were essentially those who are connected with occultic writings. Next, we had the enchanters, and these are ones who communicated with the dead or summoned spirits, say, for example, demonic spirits. Then the next one is a verb, actually. It's those who did sorcery. So it's not really a title, it's an action. It refers to those who practiced magic. Now, its meaning is a little bit obscure, but when we look at it and how it's used in context in, say, Exodus 7, verse 11, what this shows us, that what this means is that people using this kind of occultic power had the ability to essentially deceive people with lying signs and wonders. So in the case of Pharaoh, Pharaoh's magicians were able to do sorcery. They were to do this action of sorcery, which included duplicating the sign of turning staffs into snakes, and also ultimately hardening Pharaoh's heart against the truth. And also, this is a little bit of a warning to us as to why miracle signs and wonders are not of themselves a guarantee that someone is of God, because in fact the enemy can produce lying signs and wonders. So it's something we need to be careful of. And ultimately, it's the word of God that is the ultimate test of truth. So we need to test the spirits and make sure that what anyone is saying is in line with the word of God, the truth of God's word. Then finally, we have the Chaldeans, and these are a group of people who were of a particular ethnic group. The word means clod breakers. They had a farming and agricultural background, and essentially these were the ancient people who were native to this area of Babylon and stayed there following the events of Babel. And you notice Daniel's not mentioned at this point. He's not included. It's probably because he'd only just finished his training, and so was probably considered too junior to bring before the king. Also, this also points to the fact that Daniel himself would not have been involved with any of the occultic pagan practices that these groups were involved with. So let's move on to the next part of the chapter. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the word is firm. The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So here the king is explaining his problem, and the group has requested that he tell them the dream that he had, and therefore, because they knew the dream, they would certainly know the interpretation. And so this is where things are taking a bit of an unpleasant turn, because normally the king would tell them the dream and then they would give them the interpretation. But here God in his divine providence is ensuring that by the king demanding that they tell him the dream as well, is preventing anyone from pretending to know the meaning of the dream. And we notice here that the Chaldeans step forward, and that maybe as the locals, they hope to have greater favor from the king. And we see this word that they said to the king in Aramaic. So it's at this point that the language in the book of Daniel switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. And so from Daniel chapter 2, verse 3 through till the end of chapter 7, all of that section of his book is written in Aramaic. And of course, this connects to the larger theme of Daniel, which is the times of the Gentiles, because this dream provides an overview of that time period from a human perspective. Now, I guess just as a reminder, the times of the Gentiles started with the removal of King Zedekiah, who was the last rightful heir of David to rule from the throne in Jerusalem. And this times of the Gentiles will continue until the return of Messiah, who is the future rightful heir to that throne, will one day return to rule and reign from the throne of David in Jerusalem. And notice also the king's punishment here is very severe. Not only would they suffer a horrific death themselves, but their houses would be destroyed. But in contrast to any punishment for failure, if they succeeded, they would receive great gifts, rewards, and honor. So then goes on to say, then a second time and said, let the king answered a second time and said, let the king tell us his servants the dream, and we'll show its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know a certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word is from me is firm. But if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. So again, this response here, the fact that they are continuing to push back at the king, shows that what he's asking is not normally expected. And of course, they knew there would be danger in trying to push their case, but they're getting pretty desperate here. But it really only makes the king more determined. And he's making a valid point. I mean, realistically, if they can tell him the dream, then they could certainly show him its interpretation. So the Chaldeans answered, the king said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, for no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. So again, notice it's the Chaldeans, the locals, that are trying to reason with the king. And they make the point that, well, no other king has ever asked us this before. And basically, hey, what you're asking is pretty unreasonable. And they admit, well, what you're asking us to do is too difficult. No human can do it. Only a divine spiritual being could provide the answer. And what this really shows us is that these pagan men and their false gods are powerless to provide the answer. Because if the answer was with their God, small g, then certainly they would have provided it. The fact that even on pain of death, they cannot provide the answer shows they simply don't know. It means the answer is not with any of their false gods, but only with the one true God, which Daniel will soon prove. So, what's the king's response? Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. So honesty in this case was not the best policy, because they didn't get any concession from the king. He simply became more angry and sends out a decree to have them all killed. So we're assuming he's going to gather them all together and then have them executed. And so now we finally see the broader category into which Daniel falls, that of a wise man. And so in the Septuagint translation, which is the Greek Old Testament, basically, the word they use here is magi, and that's the same word that we find in Matthew chapter 2 in relation to the wise men appearing at Yeshua's birth. Okay, so this is where we get a connection between the events of Daniel and then the later events we see in the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, so just to keep that in mind. And so Daniel has to act at this point, because not only he but his three men, who were also wise men, would die as well if he didn't do anything. And keep in mind, out of that group, he was the only one, we're told in chapter 1, who had the gift of interpreting dreams. Okay? All right, so keeping on going, Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree of the king so urgent?" Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. So you notice what Daniel doesn't do here. He doesn't try and say that the king is doing anything wrong. He doesn't say, well, why is he doing this? His question is, well, why is he so urgent? In other words, okay, if we couldn't, no one could answer your question, and so, in a sense, you had the right to carry out this punishment. But why are you in such a hurry? And so Daniel basically then asks for an appointment. And see, we have this contrast here between the fury and viciousness of the king and the cool and calm of Daniel, which points to the truth of that proverb: a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Proverbs 15, verse 1. See, Daniel understands that he's not going to win any battle of words. And so he is going to request this appointment, which gives the king time to cool down, but also time for Daniel and his friends to pray. And we see also here a contrast between those pagans and their false gods who only could respond in fear, and Daniel here, who believes in the one true God and responds in faith. So Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So having sorted out a time to go and see the king, he now goes home and gathers his friends, and essentially they have a prayer meeting asking for mercy from God. And so in essence, he's confirming what the magicians had said, that only God, who would be a spirit, of course, God is spirit, could provide the answer. So although they weren't quite correct, they had the right idea. There was no way any human being could answer this, because what we're going to see is it was a mystery. And we'll look at that in a second, what that means. So you notice he's praying for mercy, and mercy is basically withholding something that is deserved. So the king actually had the authority, because they had failed at this point to provide the answer, to actually execute the wise men, because they hadn't done their job. They'd failed the king, and he actually did have the right to carry out the death penalty. It sounds a bit strange to us, but of course this is not a democracy. And so Daniel's not actually questioning the king's authority to do what he's setting out to do, but he's actually asking for God's mercy to save them from this. And so what they pray about is this mystery. And this is the first time in the Bible we get this word mentioned, And in terms of the Old Testament, it's the only book in the Old Testament to use this Aramaic word ras. Okay. And all but one use of the word occur in a single chapter, chapter 2 in the Old Testament. Okay. So what is a mystery? Well, in context, a mystery for Daniel is understanding information that had been hidden from mankind and that only God can reveal. So although the king has had the dream, its meaning was still a mystery to him, and both the dream and its interpretation are still a complete mystery to Daniel at this point. And also, the meaning of a mystery in this context means it was also hidden from pagans and their false gods. So I guess if we want to sort of give a definition of an Old Testament mystery, it is something or some specific understanding or information that is hidden from mankind and even fallen angelic beings, meaning that only God, the true God of heaven, knows this information and only He alone can reveal it. Now, this will also be the basis for the New Testament definition of a mystery with one specific distinction. In the New Testament, it is information that was never revealed or seen in the Old Testament. So otherwise, the concept is the same. In both cases, only God knows, and only God can reveal the mystery, but it's the timing of when it was revealed that is different. So if something was revealed in the Old Testament, it does not qualify to be a New Testament mystery. To be a New Testament mystery, it must have remained unseen and unrevealed until we get into the New Testament. So it was never seen in the Old Testament. So let's read further. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. For you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter. So God obviously answers their prayers, and in his mercy reveals both the dream and its interpretation to Daniel. So what's interesting here is that later on, when Daniel has dreams and visions, he will need an angel to interpret it to him. But here in chapter 2, with a Gentile king having a dream, Daniel is given the interpretation and revelation directly. And so Daniel responds with praise to God and gives all the credit to God. He acknowledges that he's the one who has the knowledge and gives that to those who have the ability to understand. God is the one who reveals the deep and hidden things, including this dream and its interpretation. Now, God knows what is in the hidden places, or in the darkness, I should say. That would include inside the human mind, where no other human person can see. But what we think in our minds is not actually hidden from God, because light dwells with him. In fact, God is light. The psalmist states there is nothing hidden from God. In Psalm 139, it says, O Lord, you have searched me and know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. So Daniel here is really speaking of God's omniscience, that God is all-knowing. And he's also declaring at the same time that God is omnipotent, that is all-powerful. So having proclaimed these divine attributes of God, Daniel gives thanks and praise to the God of his fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the covenant-keeping God. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and thus said to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste, and thus said to him, I have found amongst the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. So, having received the revelation of this mystery, he returns, meaning it would indicate that he's come back earlier than he had the appointed time he had given. He returns to Arioch and asks him to be taken before the king to show the interpretation. So Daniel, what he's going to do here is going to save the lives of all the magicians, enchanters, and Chaldeans. And so Arioch makes haste because he has good news for an angry king. So this makes Arioch looks good. Looks good. You know, he looks good here because he's got an answer to the king's problem. And so this explains why he has to tell the king who this is and what he's here for, because I believe this is happening prior to the actual original appointment time that had been made. In other words, Daniel got the answer quicker than he expected. And so he's arrived and said, right, I have the answer. And so they've had to reschedule an earlier time to see the king. Notice here that Daniel is described as an exile from Judah. And also here he's called a Gebar, a man, and not a youth. Okay, this again would tell us that when he had left Babylon, he was probably in his teenage years, and now he's seen as a young man. So the good news is that Daniel can make known to the king the interpretation of the dream. Okay, so picking up back in chapter 2 now, we're going to look at the actual interpretation of the dream. So the king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I had seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered the king and said, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in the bed are these. So the king basically sees Daniel as the one who has the information and the interpretation. And Daniel tries to set him straight. Now, I must say that the king really struggles to get his head around this, as we're going to see. But Daniel makes it very clear. He is not the source of the interpretation and information, nor is there any human person who can do this of themselves. And notice here he starts with the term wise men to describe that larger group, which included the enchanters and the magicians who we mentioned earlier. But interestingly, Daniel uses a different verb here, so not sorcerers, but astrologers. The verb that would indicate someone who used signs and stars in the sky to determine future events. And his point is that none of these groups could answer the king or reveal the mystery. That in fact there's only one who can do this, the one true God in heaven, who reveals mysteries and who has revealed this Old Testament mystery of the times of the Gentiles to King Nebuchadnezzar. And notice it also includes the latter days. So that phrase relates to future events, but what it also speaks to is it's going to cover end time events as well. So this dream is actually going to cover a broad span of history from the time of Daniel until the second coming, which at this point for us is over 2,628 years and counting. And even if we as believers were to be gathered or raptured today, there would be another 7 years at least in the future until we got to the end of the tribulation. So that's telling us just how long we have been in this time period, well over 2,600 years. And it's interesting to note that the only prophecies defined as mysteries in the Old Testament concerned the times of the Gentiles. So if you think of putting groups of different kinds of prophecies together, there's a group which are defined as mysteries, but all of those pertain to the times of the Gentiles. Then we get to the New Testament, and the mysteries in the New Testament all relate to a time period that starts with the removal of the offer of the Messianic kingdom from the generation of Yeshua's day during his first coming, with a time period which will end when a future generation of the nation of Israel finally accept Yeshua as their Messiah. So this time period between Messiah's rejection at his first coming and acceptance, which results in his second coming, is called the mystery kingdom. And all of the mysteries in the New Testament relate to that time period. And so this is interesting that basically the first one relates to the times of Gentiles, and the second one is in terms of the New Testament, they all relate to the mystery kingdom, which is between his first coming and second coming. And in the meantime, of course, in this time period we're in now, having Israel having rejected their Messiah at his first coming, will wait a future generation who will accept him for the second coming. In the meantime, God is bringing out from amongst the Gentiles during this times of the Gentiles a people for his name. All right. This is Daniel again. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. But as for me, the mystery has been revealed to me, not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. So notice Daniel's making it very clear. He's reiterating it is God alone who revealed the mystery. It was nothing to do with Daniel having some sort of greater wisdom and intellect. And the reason he was revealed, that God revealed the mystery to him, was that the king would know what this all means. In fact, God had intended for the king to know this information. And so he's using Daniel as the means of passing that information on. And here we see the principle that when it comes to the hidden thoughts of the mind, only God knows. Okay, we can't know each other's minds, but God can. And this is one aspect of Yeshua's divinity that's seen in the New Testament, because we see that on numerous occasions, Yeshua knows the inner thoughts of people's minds, and that speaks to him not only being the Son of Man, but of course being the Son of God. Now, in our next passage, we have, You saw, O king, and behold a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold altogether were broken in pieces, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. So Daniel now tells the king what he dreamed. This dream represents an overview of the times of the Gentiles from a human perspective, where the image in terms of its general appearance is seen as mighty and exceeding in splendor, and so is impressive. However, its appearance, what it actually looks like when you stop to look closer, is frightening. And this speaks to the underlying evil. This image from a distance may appear to be a wow, but closer inspection reveals it to be a whoa. So this image consists of 4 or 5 different sections, with metals that decrease in value but increase in strength. And the value relates to the level of authority held by the various kings or leaders, and the strength relates to its ongoing impact on human history. Finally, the feet incorporates the only non-metallic element, which is clay. Then a stone that is not cut with human hands strikes the image. So it not being of human hands indicates that the stone has divine origins. And interestingly, right back in Genesis chapter 49, Jacob prophesied the following. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, and harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. So notice that it is from the mighty one of Jacob, not Joseph. So the antecedent from there would be God. Okay, so in other words, from there, that is the shepherd and the stone, is from the mighty one of Jacob. Okay, so not Jacob himself, but Jacob's God. Okay, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that means that this future shepherd and stone of Israel would be God in divine terms. But these titles point to the fact that this one to come would be of Jacob in human terms. Okay, so we have here the first indication through this particular passage of the connection of the symbol of a stone or a rock to Messiah, because this is really what we're going to see develop in the scriptures, especially I've got all those references here. This is basically a messianic motif that's going to develop throughout the Old Testament and into the New. So this is basically a symbol of Messiah. And notice where this stone, this messianic stone, strikes the image, which is at its feet of iron and clay. Now that's important because it means that the striking of the image occurs at the end of the times of the Gentiles. This means that there is still a future event, as what follows is, in other words, this striking of the Gentile empires is still a future event to us, because what follows is the Messianic kingdom, and we're clearly not in the Messianic kingdom today. So the impact of the divine stone striking the image is that it is broken into pieces. It becomes like chaff or dust. It's blown away, so there's no evidence of it remaining. And this would relate to the fact that following the second coming of Messiah, he will restore the heavens and the earth. And the stone that speaks of Messiah will become a great mountain, which in Scripture symbolizes a kingdom. So that mountain or kingdom will fill the whole earth. So again, that's pointing to the fact that Messiah returns. He will rule and reign not only over the Jewish people, but over the whole world. So this was the dream. Now, we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and the might and the glory, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these things. And as you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom. But some of the fullness of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will not mix with one another in marriage. They will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. Just as you saw that a stone was cut from a mountain by no human hand, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, and the silver, and the gold. A great God has made known to the king what shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So having told the king about the dream, Daniel now interprets it for him, and he reveals that the different metals relate to different Gentile kingdoms. Nebuchadnezzar is the head of gold. So this is relating to the times of the Gentiles. He's the one, of course, who starts this time period by removing the last rightful heir of King David to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. And Daniel reveals to him that God had given him the capacity to rule the world. However, historically, Nebuchadnezzar won't achieve this outcome because he makes a decision to focus on building Babylon rather than expanding his kingdom. The next kingdom will be inferior to him in that it does not get this capacity for world rule. And as we shall see when we get to Daniel 6, the Medo-Persian rulers were actually subject to the law, whereas in contrast, Nebuchadnezzar was an absolute monarch and he was above the law. So each kingdom to follow represents a different metal, which decreases in value, but increases in strength. And what's important to keep in mind in terms of the times of the Gentiles is that each of these kingdoms will gain authority over Jerusalem in part or whole. So this is what Jesus means. He talks about the times of the Gentiles. its various Gentile kingdoms having authority over Jerusalem in part or whole. The fourth kingdom of iron is different from the first three because it has two distinct sections. Firstly, there's the leagues of iron, and that happened when the Roman Empire split into two parts, being the Western and Eastern empires. This east-west split is our present-day situation. However, there are still the feet and toes, which are a mix of iron and clay. This is future to us and relates to the 10 kingdom stage. So after initially speaking of feet and then feet and toes, Daniel focuses specifically on the toes. It is specifically the toes that are iron and soft clay mixed. Soft clay means it hadn't even been fired, and this speaks to a lack of unity in this period. So there's no intention to create unity, and so it just won't work. With Daniel having shifted his focus to these future 10 kings, he reveals that following this, the God of heaven, so it's God's will, not mankind, will set up a kingdom here on earth, not just in heaven. And so this kingdom will never be destroyed, and whereas these four Gentile kingdoms will. So that means that no other people group is going to come along after Messiah and take over, because Messiah will rule and reign without anyone bringing his kingdom to an end. So the means of bringing the times of the Gentiles to an end will be that stone not cut with human hands from a mountain. In other words, by implication, a mountain speaks of a kingdom, therefore God's kingdom, because it's not cut with any human hands, so it has divine origins. But being cut means that it is a stone that has been purposed for building. And of course, from other passages, we know Messiah is the cornerstone. But again, not being cut by any human hand speaks to his divine origins. And there are a number of passages in Scripture that speak of that. So when placed in context with other pre-existing prophecies, this is clearly speaking of Messiah. And this is confirmed in the New Testament. We have Matthew 21, Acts 4, 1 Corinthians 10, 1 Peter 2 as various places where he's referred to as being the rock or the stone and the cornerstone. So notice again, it strikes at the feet, so at the end of the times of the Gentiles, and both the metals and clay are destroyed. So in comparison to the Gentile kingdoms, which are of human origin, God's kingdom has divine origin. And whereas the Gentile empires are temporary, God's kingdom is eternal. Whereas the Gentile kingdoms are each in turn conquered, God's kingdom will never be conquered. And finally, Daniel concludes by saying that the dream is certain, that is, it has been revealed as its interpretation is sure and true, as God has now revealed this mystery. Then Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and paid homage to Daniel, and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." So here's our word mystery again. Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and the chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained at the king's court. Now, I mean, the king is well-meaning, but I don't think Daniel would have been too impressed with what the king is trying to say here, because notice the king pays homage to Daniel and not to God. He commands offerings to be made to Daniel, which probably made Daniel rather unhappy, rather than acknowledging Daniel's God. But eventually he does get there, and he does give credit where it is due, and he acknowledged that Daniel's God, not Nebuchadnezzar's God, is the God of all other gods and the Lord over human kings, and that fact that Daniel's God can reveal mysteries, that is, things that only God can know and reveal. But of course, then he can't sort of help himself, being a pagan, and he says he returns to you, have been able to reveal this mystery, okay, rather than God. And so by and large, this pagan king continues to miss the point. He's continuing to look at things horizontally from a human perspective rather than vertically from a divine perspective. And so his theology may have been challenged, but it certainly has not been changed. Again, this is probably due to the pagan thinking that if you defeated the people, you defeated their gods. And so in his mind, having defeated Israel meant he had defeated the God of Israel. But he hasn't quite realized that, yes, but this is clear that that is not true. This is not the case. Daniel is going to try and keep making this case to the king, but the king isn't probably going to get this. I don't know if he ever gets this truth, to be honest, but he certainly gets a number of occasions to come to the realization. What's also interesting is the king is now true to his word and the promises he made, and he gives Daniel the great rewards for revealing the dream and giving the interpretation. And along with the various gifts, he appoints him to a prominent position in the kingdom as a ruler of the province of Babylon. And notice this included him being put in charge of all the wise men. So one of the little things that we have to understand when we come back to, say, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 2, when the wise men appear, is to understand that several centuries earlier, they had a boss named Daniel. And he, of course, had written a book. And they in Babylon had access to that book. They would have had it in their records. And remember, a fair chunk of it was written in Aramaic, so they would have understood it. And so, therefore, this is one of the reasons as to why the wise men from Babylon knew when to arrive. We're going to see this in Daniel 9, and knew what, that where to basically go. They're going to be coming to Israel to find the King of the Jews. Okay, and he's the one who's going to give them the timeline for that. But we'll get back to that in chapter 9. So you notice here he's given these gifts and he's given prominence, but he doesn't forget his friends, and he asks for them on behalf of them, the ones who prayed with him, and they are also put in prominent positions. And essentially, he's overseeing them as the main boss back in Babylon. He oversees these other ones who have various regional areas that they cover. But this would have been very helpful to Daniel to have three like-minded men, godly men he could rely on. And again, this puts Daniel in a really good position to look over the welfare or look out for his Jewish brethren, especially when in about 8 years' time, about 5 years' time actually, more Jewish people would arrive after the second deportation, and then later a third deportation. So he's going to have both the means, the wealth, and the position, in terms of his position of authority, to be able to help out Jewish exiles coming into the land. So that's going to be a big help to those people. Then this is the summary, and it says, "And the great God has known to the king what this shall be after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure." And so we can summarize this passage. Lessons we can learn in terms of a theme of the times of the Gentiles, in particular, in relation to the Jewish people. And the first is, the times of the Gentiles will play itself out through the history of those four Gentile empires. Secondly, the times of the Gentiles is going to come to a sudden climatic end with the second coming of Messiah. And thirdly, throughout the times of the Gentiles, various Jewish people will reach prominent positions, and from those positions they will be able to aid their Jewish brethren. And that is something in Jewish history since the time of Daniel that has shown to be true many times over.